This video is meant to be an overview of how to inspect, clean, test, and assemble an EM antenna. It presumes that you have some familiarity with scientific drilling EM MWD tools. Let's start with a quick overview of how the EM antenna works by referencing the illustrated parts list number 725, EM MWD running gear. The electromagnetic signal starts in the 40-volt batteries, which is the storehouse for electrical energy, which is intelligently managed by the EM controller and sent into formation by the EM antenna. The individual parts that make up an antenna are detailed in the IPL. At the top there is a spear point, followed by the bowspring assembly, which is comprised of the bowspring body, bowsprings, and retainer rings. Next is the shorting adapter, and finally the gap pack. It is important to remember that you must completely uninstall the individual parts, including the spear point, bowsprings, bowspring body, retainer rings, and shorting adapter from the gap pack and fully separate from each other in order to properly inspect the components, as not all wear is visible while the antenna is assembled. Not all possible damage, wash, or debris are able to be displayed in this video. Please carefully inspect the antenna components after every run. A common assumption is that if it was okay for the last run, then it will be good for the next one, and that is simply not the case. The antenna should be disassembled, cleaned, inspected, reassembled, and tested after every run, no matter how short the run was. It is important to always have a backup antenna ready to deploy. Also, due to shortages, sometimes we must run components that are less than perfect, but still operational. Please reach out to operations support if you need help with a judgment call on whether or not to run an antenna component. The next step is to clean and service each component. You should have some rags, 218 O-rings, a pick, diagonal cutters, aka snips, 111 O-ring lube, copper anti-seize thread lubricant, a metal brush, and contact cleaner ready to go. Make certain to always wear protective eyewear and impact gloves. Starting at the top of the antenna is the spear point. After inspection, contact cleaner, a rag, and a wire brush are used to thoroughly clean the spear point. Take a moment to inspect it again carefully now that it is clean. Next is the bowspring body. Spray both sets of threads with contact cleaner and wipe with a rag thoroughly, then reapply anti-seize lubricant. With the shorting adapter, start by wiping it clean, then remove the O-rings. Use contact cleaner to clean the contact bands, reapply the O-rings, and apply O-ring 111 lubricant. bottom end of the gap pack is inspected and cleaned, and serviced just like the 5-pin end of an RFC or crossover. Testing, however, is different, and we will get to that later in the video. As you can see, the threads are inspected and cleaned, the used 218 O-rings are removed, contact cleaner is applied via a cotton swab to the bands to clean the connection thoroughly. Here we are inspecting and cleaning the top end of the long gap pack. Carefully inspect the connection for debris and make certain that the threads and contact bands are in good condition. A flashlight helps with this inspection. Make note that we will check that the nut is torqued to 100 foot-pounds later in the video. Both ends of the antenna will need to have the contact bands pull tested. For the bottom end, you will use the number 2 and number 3 contact band pull test gauges, and for the top connection, you will use the number 4 and number 5 pull test gauges. To test the torque on the nut at the top of the antenna, you will need a torque wrench set to 100 foot-pounds. Place the antenna on stands. It helps to have someone else around to ensure that the antenna is stable and to prevent it from kicking up while you check the torque. Next up, it's time to test the antenna. Essentially, you want to make sure that you have continuity on the number 4 line so that you know signal will transmit through the antenna. Also, you want to make sure that there's no bleed by conducting an insulation test. Set up the fluke and turn to the ohm setting. Connect the male adapter of the breakout box to the bottom end of the antenna, then short the leads together to get a baseline resistance reading. You will subtract this number from the results of the pin 4 and pin 6 readings. One lead will be placed in pin 6 on the top row of the breakout box, and the other lead will be held on the metal below the gap. You should get a reading of less than 1 ohm. Next, you'll move the lead in the breakout box to pin 4 and place the other lead firmly on the threads inside the top of the shorting adapter for a good connection. Again, you should get a reading of less than 1 ohm. The final part of the test is to perform the insulation test with a megometer set to 250 volts. The breakout box is still connected to the bottom of the long gap pack. Short the leads together to make sure that the megometer is working correctly. You should see the needle peg to the right or read 0 on a digital megger. Starting at the bottom end of the antenna with one lead held securely below the gap, use the other lead to move from pin 1 to pin 2 all the way to pin 6. The needle should not move on any pin except the last pin, pin 6, where it will peg to the right or read 0 on a digital meter. Now moving the lead to the threads in the top of the shorting adapter, the same test will be repeated, only this time you should not see the needle move or should read open on a digital meter, except for pin 4, which will peg to the right or read 0 on a digital meter. Now that we have finished testing the antenna, we will screw on a metal cap on the bottom connection. Next, we will assemble the bowspring assembly by placing the retainer on the top of the bowspring body and screw it into the shorting adapter at the top of the antenna, leaving room to insert the bowsprings, which should snap into place. Then we will place the second retainer ring on the top of the bowspring body and screw in the spear point and make sure everything is hand tight. Next, we will use zip ties or electrical tape to cinch down the bowsprings to make it easier to torque the connections with the friction wrenches. Place the friction wrenches on either side of the connection needing torqued. In this case, it is on the spear point and the top of the bowspring body. Next, we torque the connection between the bottom of the bowspring body and the shorting adapter, and finally the shorting adapter gets torqued to the bottom end of the antenna body. We mark all the connections so that we know everything has been torqued properly. This concludes the inspection, cleaning, testing, and servicing of the long gap pack antenna.